break. Gomes looking for the overlap. Alba inside. It's Messi!
Barcelona are considered to be one of the biggest clubs in world football, and rightly so. Now, I was lucky enough to grow up during the peak phase of Messi v Ronaldo, Barcelona v Real Madrid, that dominance throughout European football. However, since then, Barcelona have really dropped off. If you were to start looking at them from 2008, when Pep Guardiola took over as manager of the club, you would have seen an exciting, young, very talented team. In fact, Guardiola's Barcelona is considered to be one of the best teams ever. And if you were to look at them now, you would see a shell of what they once were. Crippling financial difficulties alongside problems on the park. They just aren't the same club that you would have remembered them being. And that's what I want to take a look at today. Let's start with Barcelona around the time that Guardiola took over, and let's see just how high they went and just how far they've fell to get to where they are now. And although they look good going into this international break, they've won their first 4 games, they're top of La Liga, it still just feels like it's a matter of time until Real Madrid pick up the pace. Because whilst Real in recent years have been thriving and have been really bolstering their squad, Barcelona have went what feels like the other way. They're rediscovering the identity of what made them such a great club, and everyone wants them to rise back up to be the best that they can. However, it's going to be a long struggle. This is going to be the first instalment of a new series I want to bring to this channel, where basically we look at some of the biggest clubs from around world football, just to get an understanding of why they fell off and what problems they're going through nowadays. And I thought no better place to start than with Barcelona, probably the biggest club in world football right now that is openly struggling in a lot of regards. Okay, let's dive into this. Now, going into the 2008-09 season, Barcelona had appointed B-team coach Pep Guardiola, and straight away he went on to prove that he was a different level of coach. In his first season, Barcelona won a treble, winning La Liga, the Copa del Rey and the Champions League.
Hey, that's pretty good.
At first, it looked like it might be a bit of a dodgy season for Guardiola, as he chose to sell Deco to Chelsea and fan favourite Ronaldinho to AC Milan. However, Barcelona finished the season 9 points in front of second place Real Madrid, and in a Messi v Ronaldo Champions League final against Manchester United, Barcelona won 2-0, with Lionel Messi even scoring in the final. And 21-year-old Lionel Messi would go on to be the club's top goal scorer for the season, scoring 38 goals across all competitions. Now, going into the 2009-10 season, Guardiola proved that it was no fluke. The big transfer news for the summer was that Guardiola okayed the sale of Samuel Eto'o to Jose Mourinho's Inter Milan. Now, Eto'o, as well as €20 million, would be given to Inter Milan in exchange for Swedish international striker Zlatan Ibrahimovic. The 6'5" striker scored 57 goals in 88 games for Inter Milan. This sale also would have risen some eyebrows pointed at Guardiola. However, out of the 6 possible competitions he could have won, Barcelona won 4 of them. They retained their La Liga title by racking up 99 points. Real Madrid racked up 96. They also won the UEFA Super Cup, as well as the FIFA Club World Cup and the Supercopa. And in the Champions League, they would actually go out to Jose Mourinho and Samuel Eto'o's Inter Milan in the semi-finals, only losing 3-2 on aggregate, but Inter Milan would go on to win the competition. Going into the 2010-11 season, which would have been Guardiola's third in charge, was one of his best at Barcelona. The big departures from the club was the sale of central midfielder Yaya Toure to Manchester City. The previous summer's big money signing Zlatan Ibrahimovic was loaned to AC Milan, and legend of the game Thierry Henry's contract was cancelled and he was allowed to leave on a free to sign for American side New York Red Bulls on a 4.5-year deal. However, coming into the club was Liverpool's holding midfielder Javier Mascherano and Valencia striker David Villa. Barcelona would go on to win La Liga again, as well as the Supercopa and the Champions League again. Lionel Messi would score 53 goals across all competitions, as Guardiola continued his reign of winning at least 3 trophies every year. Barcelona would again rack up over 95 points in the league, beating Real Madrid by 4 points in the end. And in the Champions League final, they would again beat Manchester United, this time 3-1 in Wembley. Lionel Messi and new signing David Villa both scoring in the final. Now, going into the 2011-12 season, this would be Guardiola's final year at the club. He wouldn't be able to win La Liga as they would finish second, and he would go out of the Champions League in the semi-finals. However, they would still win 4 trophies. Barcelona won the Copa del Rey, the Supercopa, the UEFA Super Cup and the FIFA Club World Cup again. Lionel Messi would score 73 goals across all competitions. The only big notable sale from that summer was Zlatan Ibrahimovic permanently being sold to AC Milan. Meanwhile, former academy player Cesc Fabregas was brought back to the club from Arsenal, and Chilean winger Alexis Sanchez was signed from Udinese. Barcelona would finish 9 points behind Real Madrid in the league, who racked up 100 points to win it. And in the Champions League, Barcelona would go out to eventual winners Chelsea. A final aggregate score of 3-2.
The season, it's Torres to give Chelsea a place in the Champions League final. The headline has been written.
And at the end of this season, Pep Guardiola would step down, with his next club being Bayern Munich. This means that after 4 years of being in charge of the club, Guardiola won 14 honours. And as I said, some of the players that he had during this time were absolutely sensational. Lionel Messi became one of the best players, and definitely one of the best players in modern football, maybe at that point even still one of the best players ever. His time at Barcelona would cement him as not only one of the best managers in the world, but Barcelona as one of the best teams in the world, and the combined duo of Barcelona and Guardiola would be seen as one of the best teams ever assembled.
I've got a bad feeling about this.
Now, going into the 12-13 season, this would be the first season in the last 4 years where Guardiola wasn't the manager of the club. So, in order to replace him, Barcelona thought a great idea would be to appoint his long-term assistant.
Yeah, this is big brain time.
That being Tito Vilanova. Now, you can sort of understand why Barcelona done this. They wanted to keep the idea there of Pep, whilst not being able to actually keep Pep there. And in his only season at the club, Vilanova wasn't amazing, but he did still win the league. Lionel Messi also racked up another 60 goals across all competitions. But Barcelona were knocked out of the Copa del Rey in the semi-finals and lost the Supercopa in the final. However, most embarrassingly, Barcelona in the Champions League exited in the semi-finals to eventual winners Bayern Munich, but they lost 7-0 on aggregate.
Wow, that's going to be the worst defeat we'll ever have against Bayern Munich.
As for transfers for this year, there wasn't really anything that interesting, no big names left the club. However, there was 2 notable signings, an Alex Song from Arsenal and a 23-year-old Jordi Alba from Valencia. However, Vilanova would be sacked at the end of this season and actually hasn't managed another team since leaving Barcelona. So moving on from that, going into the 2013-14 season, Barcelona would try again with a new manager, this time appointing Gerardo Martino, who was at the time manager of Newell's Old Boys, that obviously being the team that Lionel Messi got brought up through. And it felt like Barcelona really made this appointment with the idea of bringing in someone that Messi was fond of and that Messi liked, because, fun fact, he's actually the current manager of Inter Miami, which obviously Messi currently plays for. However, this would go on to be probably Barcelona's worst season for a long time, as they finished second in La Liga, although it was only by 3 points behind winners Atletico Madrid. They did win the Supercopa, but lost in the final of the Copa del Rey. Lionel Messi was the top goal scorer for the club of the season, but only with 41 goals, which, yes, at the time for him was quite a low number of goals. Barcelona would also exit the Champions League in just the quarter-finals, losing to eventual finalists Atletico Madrid. The big news of the summer, though, was the transfer activity of the club. Eric Abidal would leave the club to sign for Monaco on a free transfer. David Villa would leave for only €2 million at just 31 to sign for Atletico Madrid. who he would go on to win the league with, and a young Thiago Alcantara would leave Barcelona for just €25 million to sign for Bayern Munich. Barcelona didn't make too many amazing additions, however the big one was the signing of 21-year-old Brazilian winger Neymar from Santos.
Oh yeah, it's all coming together.
So, going into the 2014-15 season, Barcelona decided to appoint Luis Enrique. As a player, he'd played for both Real Madrid and Barcelona, and at the time was the manager of Celta Vigo. Now, the big news for Barcelona this summer was actually who left the club and who came into the club. Alexis Sanchez was sold to Arsenal and Cesc Fabregas was sold to Chelsea. However, coming into the club was Real Sociedad goalkeeper Claudio Bravo, young 22-year-old German goalkeeper Marc-Andre ter Stegen, one of Sevilla's best midfielders Ivan Rakitic, two defensive covering players in Thomas Vermaelen and Jeremy Mathieu, but the biggest signing of them all was Luis Suarez from Liverpool. Now, Suarez, Messi and Neymar would go on to form the famous MSN trio, in my opinion, the best front three ever assembled in world football. These three together were an absolute joke. And to absolutely no surprise, in Enrique's first season and MSN's first season, Barcelona won the treble. They won the league by just 2 points, however they did have 94 points when they won it. They also won the Copa del Rey, and for the first time since Guardiola was at the club they managed to win the Champions League, beating Juventus 3-1 in the final. This would go on to be just the start of the absolute magic that this front three would go on to achieve. Now, going into the 2015-16 season, in terms of transfers, it was a lot more quiet. Club legend Xavi retired, and long-term winger Pedro was sold to Chelsea. And the only notable signings was Arda Turan from Atletico Madrid and Alex Vidal from Sevilla. However, Barcelona would win the league, this time only winning it by 1 point, but they still managed to rack up 91 points. And they would go out of the Champions League in the quarter-finals, but again, it was to Atletico Madrid who would again make the final, unfortunately losing again to Real Madrid. But in 2 seasons, MSN had won 2 league titles and a Champions League. However, the following season would go on to be probably the most interesting that this front three would ever have. Now, going into the 2016-17 season, this would actually be Luis Enrique's last season in charge of Barcelona. In terms of transfers, again, pretty quiet. Goalkeeper Claudio Bravo leaving to join Manchester City was about the only noticeable sale. Technically, Dani Alves did leave as well, which was probably quite notable. And in terms of incomings, they signed Samuel Umtiti from Olympique Lyon and raided Valencia for Andre Gomes and Paco Alcacer. In the league, this time they would finish second, 3 points behind Real Madrid. However, the big story was in the Champions League. Barcelona would top a group that had Manchester City, Borussia Mönchengladbach and Celtic in it. And in the round of 16, they would play Paris Saint-Germain. The first leg was to be played in Paris and PSG won 4-0. Angel Di Maria scored twice, Julian Draxler scored and Edison Cavani. The second leg to this turned out to be probably the single best comeback you will ever see in the history of the sport. Because of the away goals rule that existed at the time, Barcelona would have to win the game by 5 goals in order to go through. If they won the game by 4 goals, it would take it to extra time. Unless PSG scored, in which case 4 goals would see PSG through because they had an away from home goal, whereas Barcelona didn't. Straight away in this game, Luis Suarez scored in the 3rd minute, which made it 4-1 on aggregate. An own goal in the 40th minute from Cazorla made it 4-2 on aggregate. Lionel Messi would score a penalty in the 50th minute, which would make it 4-3 on aggregate. Barcelona needed 1 goal to take this to extra time. We had never seen this before. In the 62nd minute, Edison Cavani would score. That made it 5-3 on aggregate and meant Barcelona had half an hour to score 3 goals and not concede any more. Come the 87th minute, the score remained on aggregate 5-3 to PSG. Neymar would score an absolute worldie of a free kick in the 88th minute. But I mean, the game's pretty much done. We're going into injury time. Barcelona still need 2 goals. Well, Neymar would score a penalty in the 91st minute. Barcelona are now about to exit the Champions League, having came back 5-1 because of the away goals rule. But then in a moment of just complete chaos, Sergi Roberto in the 95th minute managed to score a winner. How do you lose from 4-0 up? How? It was an absolute embarrassment for PSG. It was a magical night for Barcelona. The single best comeback that has ever been achieved in world football. And then in the quarter-finals, Barcelona would draw Juventus. They lost 3-0 in Italy this time. 2 goals from Dybala and 1 from Chiellini, and then in the greatest comeback ever, part 2, they couldn't do it and drew 0-0 at home against Juventus. So Barcelona would go out, Juventus would go on to make the final and lose to Real Madrid. Following this, Luis Enrique would leave the club and Barcelona would begin a slow descent. Now, going into the 2017-18 season, Barcelona would replace Luis Enrique with another former player in Ernesto Valverde, who at the time was the manager of Athletic Bilbao. Now, the big thing to take away from this season was the transfers involving the club. Now, PSG were actually so impressed with Neymar in that 6-1 win that they decided to basically break the entire global transfer market to sign him. €222 million, highest fee ever. And you really wonder if that will ever actually be broken. Now that amount of money to come into Barcelona should have been an absolute godsend. However, it wasn't in the long run. Instead of being cautious and calculated with the money, Barcelona decided to spend all of it in the one summer. Ousmane Dembele from Borussia Dortmund and Felipe Coutinho from Liverpool were brought in each for €135 million, and Brazilian centre mid Paulinho was also brought in for €40 million, as well as Benfica right back Nelson Semedo for €35 million. Now, we'll come back to Coutinho and Dembele later in this video. However, this would only be the beginning of some very reckless spending by Barcelona. Now, at the start, it didn't actually pan out too badly. Barcelona romped La Liga, winning the league by 14 points. And they would also win the Copa del Rey that season as well and finish second in the Supercopa. However, in the Champions League, it was yet another embarrassing run. Barcelona would go out in the quarter-finals. They played Roma and won 4-1 in the first leg in Barcelona and then managed to lose 3-0 in Rome. If you've never watched this game, go back and watch the highlights because it is absolutely fantastic. Edin Dzeko opened the scoring in the 6th minute, Daniele De Rossi scored a penalty not long after half-time, and Kostas Manolas scored in the 82nd minute to make it 4-4 on aggregate, but the away goals rule was still a thing at the time, so because Roma had scored in Barcelona and Barcelona couldn't get a goal in Rome, Roma went through. 2 really embarrassing Champions League exits in 2 years for Barcelona, who really would have hoped for a lot better. Now, in the 18-19 season, Barcelona would again have a pretty successful campaign. Once again, they would win the league, they would finish second in the Copa del Rey and win the Supercopa. They would exit the Champions League in the semi-finals. Transfers for this season weren't too bad. Paulinho left for €40 million to go back to China. Yerry Mina left for €30 million to join Everton in the Premier League, as did left-back Luca Dean. Gerard Deulofeu left to join Watford. Marlon left to join Sassuolo, and Alex Vidal went to Sevilla. Coming into the club, Barcelona still did spend a decent amount of money, but nothing too crazy. Malcolm came in from Bordeaux for €40 million. Clement Longley from Sevilla for 35, Artur Melo from Grêmio for 31, Arturo Vidal from Bayern Munich for just below 20, and Emerson Royal from Brazil. Barcelona would again romp the league title, winning by 11 points this time. Real Madrid really weren't going through a good domestic period at this time. However, again, in the Champions League, Barcelona would take all the headlines. They beat Lyon in the last 16, they would put Manchester United out with relative ease in the quarter-finals, and then in the semi-finals they would take on Liverpool. The first leg would be held in Barcelona, which Barcelona won 3-0, Suarez scored and Messi got a brace, including an absolute worldie of a free kick. How did the second leg go again? How do they keep... How this is like 3-4 years in a row now. How do they keep making an arse of it this badly? 2 goals from Divock Origi and 2 goals from Jorginho Wijnaldum, including the famous "it's taken quickly" corner, saw Liverpool win 4-0 on the night, and Barcelona would go out of the Champions League again. If they scored just 1 goal, Liverpool had to score 5 to put them out. The away goals rule was still in effect at this point. They should not have went out. Okay, so going into the 2019-20 season, this would not be a kind one for Barcelona. It would actually be the first time that they would go trophyless since 2008. In January of this season, Ernesto Valverde was actually sacked and replaced with Quique Setién. His most recent job before Barcelona was actually the manager of Real Betis. Now, in the transfer market, this is where their problems began. Let's start with who left the club. Malcolm left a year after joining. Dutch goalkeeper Jasper Cillessen was sold to sign for Valencia. Andre Gomez left to sign for Everton, Paco Alcacer left to sign for Borussia Dortmund, and Denis Suarez left to sign for Celta Vigo. Felipe Coutinho was also loaned to Bayern Munich. We'll get back to that one in a minute. Coming into the club, it was just as ridiculous as it was 2 years beforehand. 120 million euros was spent on Antoine Griezmann. 86 million euros was spent on Frankie de Jong, 26 on Brazilian goalkeeper Neto, 23 on 17-year-old Pedri, 20 on Junior Firpo, and 18 million on Martin Braithwaite. Barcelona would finish second in the Liga to their credit, only 5 points behind Real Madrid, who'd finally got their shit together. Now, we should probably talk about this as well. In 2019-20, the world received the big cough, and the Spanish Football League was actually suspended from the 12th of March until the 11th of June. So this season was basically a bit scuffed. It went on a lot longer than it should. Now, this also affected the Champions League, and by the time the Champions League reached the knockout stages, in the round of 16, everything went ahead as normal, but in the quarter-finals, the semi-finals and the finals, there would only be 1 leg instead of 2. Now, in the round of 16, before the break, Barcelona beat Napoli 4-2 on aggregate to go into the quarter-finals. In the quarter-finals, they would face Bayern Munich. This was one of the single most interesting games I've ever watched. Barcelona would lose 8-2, going 1-0 down in the 4th minute before making it 1 each in the 7th. They would then concede 3 unanswered from Ivan Perisic, Serge Gnabry and another from Thomas Müller. Luis Suarez would make it 4-2 before Joshua Kimmich would score, Robert Lewandowski would score, and Felipe Coutinho would come off the bench to score twice. He was contracted to Barcelona. How do you concede not only 8 goals, but 2 of them was to a player that plays for you? You loaned him to Bayern, he came off the bench and still scored as many goals as your entire team in the 90 minutes. He also set up what Lewandowski's goal. He had more goal involvements than your team against you. This was one of the most embarrassing Champions League losses that Barcelona would ever experience, and this really cemented the start of Barcelona's downfall. This reckless spending that we mentioned earlier in the video about Barcelona's signings this summer would actually be made 10 times worse, because when the football did resume later on in the season, every game was played behind closed doors, so revenue for every team across the entirety of world football really started to dry up. But because earlier in the season Barcelona had already spent massive money to bring in these players, that meant they were still tied into paying the massive wages that came along with these players. Okay, going into the 2020-21 season, manager Quique Setién was obviously not being kept on after the humiliation of the previous season. He was replaced by another former player in Ronald Koeman. Now, to be fair to Koeman, he was actually a somewhat successful manager. At the time, he was the manager of the Netherlands. However, whilst manager of Barcelona, it would be an improvement, but not a particularly great one. Barcelona would finish 3rd in the league, they would win the Copa del Rey, they would finish 2nd in the Supercopa, and exit the Champions League in the last 16. However, the transfer market would be Barcelona's big downfall for this season. We'll start off with an immediately dodgy deal. Artur Melo was sold to Juventus for €80 million before Barcelona then immediately bought Miralem Pjanic from Juventus for €60 million, which was quite a weird one there. Also joining the club would be Portuguese winger Trincao from Braga, American right-back Serginho Dest from Ajax, a young Ansu Fati was promoted from the academy, as well as Ronald Araujo, and Felipe Coutinho would return from loan. However, it was the people exiting the club that really hurt Barcelona most this season. Nelson Semedo was sold to Wolves for over €30 million. This deal was fine. Carles Perez was sold to Roma and Marco Correa was sold to Getafe. However, the big two was Ivan Rakitic being sold to Sevilla for just €3.5 million and Luis Suarez being sold to Atletico Madrid for €9 million. The 33-year-old Uruguayan striker was deemed no longer necessary at the club. And how did this pan out for them? Absolutely dreadfully. As I said earlier, Barcelona would finish third. Luis Suarez, who joined Atletico Madrid, would win the league again, this time with Atletico Madrid. They finished 2 points above Real in second, and Barca would finish 5 points behind Real Madrid in third, only 2 in front of Sevilla in fourth. Then in the Champions League, as I said, Barcelona would be battered out in the last 16, losing 5-2 on aggregate to PSG. Okay, by the time the 2021-22 season rolled around, Barcelona had also decided to move on from Ronald Koeman and appointed, who would have guessed, another former player, but this time it was in very recent former player Xavi. Now, by this point, Barcelona were really struggling, so Xavi finished second in La Liga, finishing 13 points behind Real Madrid. He was knocked out of the Copa del Rey in the last 16 and exited the Supercopa in the semi-finals. In the Champions League, they would not even make it through the group stage, finishing third and falling down into the Europa League, something that was just unheard of for Barcelona. And they would be knocked out of the Europa League by Frankfurt in just the quarter-finals. Now, around about this time, as I said, Barcelona's troubles really started to kick in, and a lot of this was financially. It came out during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 that actually Barcelona were over €1.35 billion in debt. Now, this came from a number of different factors, but these included massive transfer fees, enormous player wages, huge running costs, very little return for players that they were spending massive fees on, and the pandemic forcing the shutting of basically their stadium, so a lot of income revenue, matchday revenue, was totally halted. And by this point, Barcelona were majorly struggling. In the transfer window, it started to show. The only incomings were €55 million on 21-year-old Spanish winger Ferran Torres. Memphis Depay was brought in on a free, as well as Eric Garcia, Sergio Aguero, Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang, Adama Traore and Luke de Jong. A 38-year-old Dani Alves returned for a year, and 16-year-old sensation Gavi was brought up from the youth team. Unfortunately, because of the way the market was working, everyone was affected by COVID, Barcelona really struggled with outgoings. Miralem Pjanic was loaned to Besiktas, Felipe Coutinho was loaned to Aston Villa, Sergio Aguero suffered heart problems during the season and was forced to retire, Trincao was loaned to Wolves, Antoine Griezmann was loaned back to Atletico Madrid only 2 years after joining the club, Junior Firpo was sold to Leeds, and Emerson Royal was sold to Spurs. Because of Barcelona's massive financial troubles, they actually couldn't afford to register Lionel Messi for the season. Messi was willing to take as big a pay cut as it was needed, but unfortunately laws in Spain meant he couldn't take more than a 50% wage cut, which he would have had to take in order for Barcelona to be able to afford to register him. As such, Messi, the greatest player to ever play for Barcelona, left the club on a free to join PSG. The 22-23 season saw things improve for Barcelona, at least domestically. Xavi managed to win La Liga by 10 points, beating Real Madrid in second. Barcelona exited the Copa del Rey in the semi-finals but did win the Supercopa. Once again in the Champions League, however, it was a bit of an embarrassment. They went out in the group stages, finishing third and going back into the Europa League again, where they were immediately knocked out in the playoff round by Manchester United. However, again, this isn't the end of the world for Barcelona, as they were really struggling with financial difficulties still. And they decided to go about that by not behaving in the transfer market at all. 25-year-old Brazilian winger Rafinha was bought from Leeds for almost €60 million. 23-year-old French right-back Jules Koundé was bought from Sevilla for €50 million. Bayern Munich legend Robert Lewandowski was bought for €45 million at the same age that Luis Suarez was when Barcelona decided he was no longer of any use to them. Frank Kessié, Andreas Christensen, Hector Bellerin and Marcos Alonso were all brought in on free transfers as well. And leaving the club, Felipe Coutinho was sold for just €20 million to Aston Villa permanently. Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang left to join Chelsea. Memphis Depay was sold for just €3 million to Atletico Madrid. Trincao was loaned to Sporting Lisbon and Samuel Umtiti was loaned to Lecce. Miralem Pjanic, Ricky Puig, Martin Braithwaite, Neto and Dani Alves all left the club on free transfers, with Serginho Dest, Clement Longley both being loaned out and Gerard Piqué retiring. And in the season before our current one, the 2023-24 season, it wasn't another great season for Barcelona. This would be Xavi's last season. They would finish second in the league, 10 points behind winners Real Madrid. They would exit the Copa del Rey in the quarter-finals, the Supercopa they would come second, and the Champions League they would exit in the quarter-finals, losing 6-4 on aggregate to PSG. However, they did behave themselves a little bit more in the transfer market, which probably was the main thing. Their only notable signing was young 18-year-old Brazilian striker Vitor Roque, who was bought in for €40 million. Other than that, Ilkay Gundogan, Iango Martinez were both brought in on free transfers, and João Cancelo and João Felix were both loaned in. Ousmane Dembele was sold to PSG for €50 million. This was another player who was bought 6 years prior for over €130 million and definitely didn't live up to the potential. Another £120 million signing, Antoine Griezmann, was sold back to Atletico Madrid for just €22 million. Frank Kessié was sold to Saudi Arabia for 12.5, and Trincao was sold to Sporting Lisbon permanently for €7 million. Sergio Busquets, Jordi Alba and Samuel Umtiti would all leave the club on free transfers. And that takes us to our current season, where Barcelona have replaced former head coach Xavi with German manager Hansi Flick. In the transfer market, they've still kind of behaved. Their only signing was Dani Olmo for €55 million. When this is their only transfer business, it's not too bad, seeing as they do now have constant streams of revenue that the stadiums have now been open again for the last few seasons. Tidying up their wage bill as well, with Serginho Dest being allowed to leave on a free, as well as Ilkay Gundogan and Sergio Roberto, as well as Marcos Alonso. The only interesting thing is Vitor Roque. They seem to have fallen out with him already after just a year. He's been loaned to Real Betis for the season, and they didn't choose to sign either João Felix or João Cancelo. Barcelona have really tried to improve themselves by being wise with their managerial appointments and really taking advantage of their youth system. La Masia is their biggest asset, and it is the key to taking Barcelona back to their best. They are by no means an amazing team compared to what they used to be, but they are definitely on the rise again. However, it will take a few years to build them back up. So I just want to say thank you to everyone who's made it this far into the video. This was a video that was great fun to make. It's a bit longer, but I'm hoping to do more videos like this in the future, where we can really take a dive into teams and see how they've looked over a longer period. So thank you to everyone that's made it this far. I really hope you enjoyed. Please hit the subscribe button, it really helps me out, and I'll see everyone in the next video.